So, this book review is on a book called Why? The Purpose of the Universe, and it's by a philosopher named Philip Goff. And I was interested in reading this book because recently Philip Goff has been talking to a lot of these public or popular sort of theologians and philosophers, and he's sort of announced that he had come from an atheist background, but is now a what he calls heretical Christian, and that's because his kind of formulation and understanding of what that means to be a Christian is certainly not anything like the the modern evangelical understanding of Christianity. It's something a little bit more like the Orthodox Church is the way he describes it. As I see it, it's somewhat similar to an understanding of process theology. So this book actually came out a little bit before he announced this, and so I don't know if he was quite in that space when he wrote this. This text, as you can imagine from the somewhat ambitious title, is really about these huge topics, primarily whether or not the universe has purpose and what that looks like. And so in this text, he's basically talking about a couple of different things, really. He really, in the first chapter, basically describes why he believes that the universe does have purpose. Now, it's important to recognize throughout the book, he's arguing from the perspective of a philosopher. And so there's not necessarily like a ton of data or scientific evidence. He's talking from the grounds of a thought experiment type of person. And that's not just armchair philosophy, right? Philosophers like Philip Goff do this in a really deep way. And so there are a lot of arguments that will sound familiar to people who just think about this a lot, but his arguments are much more formalized. They're much more rigorous academically. So he describes a few different things. Now, it's about in the first chapter, again, he talks about just the fact that the universe seems to have some sort of purpose. And then he goes on in the subsequent chapters, and there are only 7, they're just a little bit bigger, to discuss things like, whether or not there is a God, where the universe comes from, and, what we do with all of that information. Now, just briefly, the layout or the organization of the book is helpful in the sense that what he does is he makes it very clear how you can read the book if you're just kind of looking for the gist of everything that he's saying. And there are sections that you can kind of skip over if you don't really care about the deeper details. And so there's a little bit more rigorous discussion in certain parts. So he describes that and explains as you go where you might want to keep reading or just move along, depending on what you're interested in. Now, beyond just the fact that the universe has purpose, he talks a lot about this idea of panpsychism. I think this is really more of the central focus of the text, and this is basically the idea that the universe has intrinsically this consciousness to it, and that's why we have consciousness. So he's addressing this question of consciousness, which is the question now that we, of course, don't know enough about yet, and we're still working on what that means to have consciousness. And so he tackles it by suggesting this idea that the universe has these conscious parts. It is inherently conscious, and what we as conscious beings emerge out of that. So you'll have to read it to get the more detailed description of how that works. But in this argument, he basically talks about a few different things. He talks about a variety of alternative views for understanding where the universe has come from, what type of God maybe there is, or how plausible these ideas are. Now, something important that comes out of this book is his understanding of what is the most plausible reason for the universe's existence and why it is the way that it is. Now, he believes that the omni-God, a God that is all-powerful and all-knowing and omniscient, this sort of God can't exist. It just doesn't make sense with what we see in the world around us. His view is that the best explanation for what we see in the world is a type of God that is not all-powerful, And he's not the first to suggest something like this. Theologians such as Thomas J. Ord talk about this too. So it's, it's not a unique idea, but that's essentially where he is now. So this is post this book being written and being published. He's been talking with various people about how he is, in some sense a Christian, and, he discusses what that means for him. But basically, he does believe that there is most likely some being we could call God, but is simply not this omnipotent type of being that we've thought about for centuries now. So there's certainly a lot more than that in the book, but that is one of the most interesting aspects of it, and one of the things that I found very interesting reading through it. Beyond that, the end of the book is basically he tries to describe some application. And interestingly, he gets into politics, specifically the whole idea of capitalism and alternative forms of living in society. And he uses this as an application for how we understand our place in the world together. So kind of following the theme of purpose. And so I won't say too much about that, but it was a very interesting and helpful discussion about what capitalism is and taxes, and he talks somewhat in detail about this. Overall, I'd say the book is 9 out of 10. I think maybe if it was just a focus of one thing, it might have been, there could have been a little bit more to it. Not that he wasn't thorough. He was relatively thorough in all of his arguments. He talked a lot of deep philosophical arguments for each of the points that he was making. And so that was really neat and really helpful to hear. Now, I think Philip Goff is writing another book as we speak, and so that'll be published at some point soon. And I think this one's going to be even more interesting because of where he is right now as someone who claims to be a sort of Christian, and, has this idea of this non-omni God, which I think is somewhat appealing to a lot of people today. So I would say, keep a lookout for that. But this was a great book. It was really helpful. It was a good kind of cross-section between, you've got some physics he talks a lot about, and obviously philosophy and some theology mixed in there too. So really cool. And I would give it a read if you get the chance.